December 24th, 1944, Fort Devens, Massachusetts. When American soldiers served Christmas dinner to German prisoners of war, 24-year-old Greta Hoffman stood before a feast and spoke 5 words that would change her life forever. This meal makes us ashamed. Not ashamed of the Americans who had captured her, ashamed of the Germany that had lied to her for 6 years. 23 women had arrived at this prisoner camp believing Americans were starving barbarians. A single bowl of potato soup had begun to prove them wrong. This is the story of how food became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, and how 9 enemy soldiers chose captivity over freedom in their own homeland. But to understand why potato soup could shatter a lifetime of propaganda, we need to go back 6 weeks to a cold November morning when these women first discovered what their enemy's abundance really meant. Greta Hoffman was born in Stuttgart in 1920, the daughter of a machinist who believed in hard work and the industrial strength of Germany. Her father died in 1940 during the invasion of Poland, killed not in combat but by pneumonia in a poorly supplied field hospital. Her mother never fully recovered from the loss, becoming a shadow woman who moved through their apartment like a ghost. Greta's younger brother Klaus was 16 in 1944, already conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent east to fight the Soviets. His letters home had stopped coming months ago. In March of 1943, with the war turning against Germany and factories desperate for workers to replace men sent to the front, Greta joined the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, the Women's Auxiliary Corps. She was trained as a communications operator, taught to manage radio equipment and relay messages between command posts. The work was technical and demanding, but it made her feel useful in a war that had already taken her father and would likely take her brother. The propaganda told her she was defending the homeland from barbaric invaders who wanted to destroy everything German civilization had built. She believed it because believing gave purpose to the grinding exhaustion of 12-hour shifts and shrinking rations. By January 1944, Greta's unit was deployed to occupied France, working in a signal station that coordinated Wehrmacht communications across the northern sectors. The work was the same, relaying messages and maintaining equipment, but the context had changed. Allied bombing raids grew more frequent. The confidence that had characterized German military operations in earlier years had given way to a defensive urgency that everyone could feel but no one dared speak about openly. Rations grew smaller, equipment broke down and could not be replaced. The propaganda broadcast continued to promise imminent victory, but the evidence of Greta's own eyes suggested something very different. August 1944 brought chaos that no amount of propaganda could disguise. Allied forces broke through German lines in Normandy and began a rapid advance that swept aside defensive positions like sandcastles before a tide. Greta's signals unit was ordered to retreat, then to hold position, then to retreat again, as command structures collapsed into confusion. On a dusty road outside Caen, with American tanks visible in the distance and German forces streaming past in disorganized flight, Greta and 22 other women from auxiliary units found themselves surrounded by American soldiers who seemed almost surprised to have captured them. The Americans separated the women from male prisoners and transported them to a temporary holding facility in England. There was processing paperwork, medical examinations, and long days of waiting in converted barracks, while bureaucracy decided what to do with female prisoners of war who were not supposed to exist in anyone's planning documents. Finally, in late October, they were loaded onto a transport ship bound for North America. The crossing took 2 weeks, most of which Greta spent in a fog of seasickness and disorientation, unable to eat the unfamiliar food and unable to keep down what little she forced herself to swallow. They arrived in Boston Harbor on November 3, 1944, and were transferred to trucks for transport to their final destination. Through gaps in the canvas covering, Greta caught glimpses of America. The buildings were intact, undamaged by bombing. The streets were full of automobiles. People walked with purpose, but without the haunted urgency that had characterized European cities for years. It looked impossibly normal, as if war was something happening in another world entirely. The truck rattled through the Massachusetts countryside on a cold November afternoon, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms now little more than tattered reminders of a war that had already moved beyond them. Greta pressed her face against the cold metal slats, watching the American landscape roll past with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. The women around her represented different corners of Germany and different reasons for serving. Liesel Kraus, 32 years old, had been a nursing student in Hamburg before the war interrupted her training. She had joined the Auxiliary Medical Corps believing she could save lives, and for a time, she had tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals that grew more chaotic and undersupplied with each passing month. Her skilled hands had tried to save countless men during the final desperate months, but there had been too many wounded and too few supplies. The memories of those she could not save haunted her eyes. Anna Becker, 28, had worked as a clerk in a Wehrmacht administrative office, maintaining the endless paperwork that kept military bureaucracy functioning even as everything else fell apart. She'd been good at her job, perhaps too good, finding satisfaction in bringing order to chaos through properly filed documents and accurate record keeping. She kept a small pencil stub hidden in her uniform pocket even now, as if maintaining records might somehow preserve her sense of purpose in a world that had stripped away everything else. Erna Weber, the youngest at 19, had been trained as a radio operator, but discovered an unexpected talent for repairing the mechanical equipment that kept German communications functioning. Her small hands could coax broken machines back to life with an intuitive understanding that impressed even the male technicians who had initially dismissed her. She had believed she was doing essential work, keeping soldiers connected to command, to each other, to home. Now she understood she had been helping coordinate a war Germany was losing catastrophically. They had not spoken much during the journey across the Atlantic. What was there to say? They were prisoners, now defeated soldiers in a war that Germany was clearly losing, despite what remained of the propaganda broadcasts. Everything they had believed, everything they had been promised, had dissolved in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority. They had seen their cities bombed from the air until nothing remained but rubble and smoke. They had watched their armies broken and scattered. They had felt their certainty shatter like glass under a hammer. And now they were being delivered to their enemies, expecting the cruelty and vengeance that German propaganda had always promised would be America's treatment of prisoners. The truck slowed, then stopped. Through the slats, Greta could see tall wire fences and wooden guard towers silhouetted against the gray November sky. A sign in English marked the entrance to what would become their new home, though the words meant nothing to her limited understanding of the language. The rear gate of the truck opened, flooding the dark interior with pale afternoon light that made everyone squint and turn away. An American officer stood waiting, a woman in uniform, which surprised Greta. She had not expected to see American women in military roles. The officer's expression was not the hatred Greta had anticipated. It was something else entirely, something that would take her weeks to understand. It looked almost like concern, as if the arrival of enemy prisoners was cause for worry rather than triumph. The women climbed down from the truck with the stiff movements of people who had been traveling for days without rest. Their legs trembled as they touched solid ground, and several had to steady themselves against the vehicle's metal frame. Greta noticed how the American guards watched them with curiosity rather than hostility, a detail that unsettled her more than open aggression would have. She had been prepared for cruelty, had steeled herself to face whatever punishment her captors chose to inflict. She did not know how to interpret kindness from an enemy, or even whether kindness was what she was actually seeing. Captain Margaret Hayes stood before the assembled prisoners, her posture military correct, but her expression softer than any German officer Greta had ever encountered. Through a translator, an older German-American sergeant who spoke with a heavy accent that placed him somewhere between two worlds, the captain explained the camp rules. They would be housed in a converted barracks building. They would have work assignments. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, which meant certain standards of food, shelter, and humane treatment were guaranteed regardless of their status as enemies. The translator stumbled over some words, switching between English and German in ways that created odd hybrid sentences. Greta found herself unconsciously correcting his grammar in her mind, drawing on the limited English she had learned in school before the war made such education seem frivolous compared to more practical skills. She understood perhaps half of what was being said, enough to grasp the basic rules, but not enough to catch the nuances that might reveal what kind of captivity truly awaited them. The camp itself was smaller than Greta had expected, clearly not designed for large numbers of prisoners. The barracks building looked recently constructed, its wood still pale and unseasoned by weather. Through the windows, she could see rows of cots with thin mattresses and folded blankets. It looked Spartan, but clean. Nothing like the overcrowded conditions she had endured during the chaotic retreat through France or the makeshift holding facilities in England. Still, it was a prison, and they were captives, and nothing about the tidy appearance could change that fundamental reality. As they were led toward the barracks, Greta noticed the kitchen building nearby. Smoke rose from its chimney, and even from a distance, she could smell something cooking. Her stomach clenched painfully at the scent, a physical response she could not control. It had been days since their last proper meal, and months since she had eaten anything that could be called adequate. The German rations had grown progressively smaller as supply lines collapsed, and by the time of her capture, she had been surviving on whatever scraps could be found, sometimes going entire days with nothing but weak tea and a piece of hard bread. The other women had noticed the smell too. She could see it in the way they turned their heads toward the kitchen, in the involuntary swallowing that indicated their own hunger. Liesel walked beside Greta, her medical bag still clutched to her chest, despite having been searched multiple times during processing. The bag contained only basic supplies, now most of her equipment having been confiscated as potentially dangerous, but she carried it like a talisman of her former purpose, the last physical connection to her identity as a healer. Without looking at Greta, Liesel whispered in German, her voice barely audible above the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path. "Do you think they will starve us? It is what we would do to them." Greta had no answer to give. She had heard stories about Allied treatment of prisoners, most of them from German propaganda, that she no longer trusted after seeing how many other lies had been told. But she also knew what German camps did to their prisoners, had heard whispers about conditions in the East that made her blood run cold, even though she had no direct evidence, and had been taught not to believe such reports. The thought that Americans might respond with equal brutality seemed entirely reasonable, a kind of rough justice that would make sense in the moral accounting of war. They would find out soon enough what kind of captivity awaited them. The women were given 30 minutes to settle into their assigned bunks before being summoned to the mess hall. Greta had expected to be left in the barracks for the rest of the day, perhaps given watery soup and hard bread. If they were fortunate, then sent to sleep off the exhaustion of their journey. Instead, an American corporal appeared at their door and gestured for them to follow him. He was young, could not have been older than 20, with a farm boy's build and an expression that was neutral but not unkind. He walked slowly enough that the exhausted women could keep pace without struggling. The mess hall was warm, heated by a large pot-bellied stove in the corner that radiated comfort into the space. Long tables with benches filled the room, and at one end Greta could see a serving line where American soldiers were receiving their meals. Her first thought was that the prisoners would eat separately, perhaps after the Americans had finished receiving whatever leftovers remained. But the corporal led them directly to the serving line, handing each woman a metal tray and utensils as if they were simply other soldiers waiting for their dinner. Greta stood behind Anna in line, watching as the woman ahead of her received her portion. The American cook, a heavy-set man with flour dusting his apron, ladled thick soup into a bowl and placed it on Anna's tray. Then he added a piece of bread, not the hard dark bread of German rations, but soft white bread that looked impossibly fresh. Then butter, a pat of real butter that caught the light like yellow gold. Then a cup of what appeared to be real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking for years. Anna stood frozen, staring at her tray, as if unable to process what she was seeing. The cook said something in English, probably asking her to move along, but Anna just stood there until the woman behind her gently touched her elbow and guided her forward. When Greta reached the serving line, she watched the cook's hands as he filled her bowl. The soup was pale thick with potatoes and cream studded with bits of bacon and onions. Steam rose from its surface, carrying a scent that made her mouth water uncontrollably. She had not seen soup this thick since before the war, when her mother's kitchen still had access to proper ingredients. Even during the early years of the conflict, when Germany was still winning and confidence ran high, rations had been carefully controlled. This single bowl contained more food than she had eaten in the past 3 days combined. The cook looked at her, seemed to notice her staring, and smiled. He said something in English that she did not understand, but his tone was friendly, almost apologetic, as if he was sorry the food was not better. Then he ladled an additional portion into her bowl, filling it nearly to the rim. Greta's hands shook as she carried her tray to the nearest table. Around her, the other German women sat in stunned silence, looking at their meals as if they might disappear at any moment. No one ate. They simply stared at the impossible abundance before them, trying to understand what kind of enemy would feed its prisoners like this. Liesel was the first to break the silence. She picked up her spoon with trembling fingers and dipped it into the pale soup, watching the thick liquid coat the metal. Then she brought it to her lips and tasted. Her eyes closed, and for a moment her entire body seemed to sag with something that looked like grief. When she opened her eyes again, tears were streaming down her face. She was not crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of tasting real food after so many months of deprivation. The sight of Liesel's tears seemed to give the others permission to eat. Greta lifted her own spoon and tasted the soup. The flavors exploded across her tongue with an intensity that felt almost painful. Creamy potatoes, rich butter, smoky bacon, the sharp bite of onions, all of it combined into something that seemed impossibly luxurious. She had been told that Americans were suffering from the war, that their economy was collapsing, under the strain of fighting on two fronts, that their people were making terrible sacrifices to sustain their military effort. This soup made a liar of every propaganda broadcast she had ever heard. Around the table, the German women ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. This was the concentrated quiet of people experiencing something profound, something that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies. Greta watched Erna, the youngest among them, eating her bread with such careful attention that each bite seemed like a meditation. The girl had been rail thin when they boarded the transport ship, her uniform hanging loose on her frame. Now she ate as if trying to memorize the sensation of having enough food. The American soldiers in the mess hall went about their meals with casual indifference to the abundance surrounding them. They chatted with each other, laughed at jokes, complained about duties and officers in the universal language of enlisted men everywhere. Some even left food on their trays when they finished scraping uneaten portions into waste bins without a second thought. Greta found this last detail almost obscene. In Germany, leaving food uneaten had become unthinkable. Every crumb was precious. Every scrap was saved. Every meal was consumed completely because no one knew when the next one might come or how large it might be. But these Americans treated plenty as if it were ordinary, as if thick potato soup and fresh bread and real butter were simply the expected standard rather than unattainable luxuries. They ate without fear, without hoarding, without the careful rationing that had become second nature to anyone who had lived in Germany for the past 2 years. Their casual abundance was more shocking than any deliberate display of wealth could have been. Captain Hayes entered the mess hall and walked slowly between the tables, observing the German prisoners as they ate. She stopped near Greta's table, and through the translator who had accompanied her, she asked a question. "Is the food acceptable?" The translator's German was formal and stilted, the phrasing awkward, but the meaning was clear enough. Greta looked up at the captain, searching for sarcasm or mockery in her expression, but found none. The question had been asked in genuine concern, as if the captain actually cared whether her prisoners found their meal satisfactory. Greta managed to speak, her voice rough from disuse and emotion. "It is—" She paused, searching for adequate words in her limited English vocabulary. "It is thick." The translator relayed this to Captain Hayes, who looked confused by the statement. But Greta could not explain what she meant, could not articulate that the thickness of the soup represented everything that separated American abundance from German scarcity, that in those two syllables she was trying to express her complete disorientation at discovering that her enemies ate like kings while her own people starved. The thickness was not just a description of consistency, it was a measure of the vast gulf between what she had been told and what was actually true. That first night in the barracks, none of the women could sleep despite their exhaustion. They lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, or whispering to each other in the darkness, trying to process what they had experienced. The meal had shaken something fundamental in their understanding of the war and their place in it. Greta listened to the conversations floating through the room, hearing the same confusion and disbelief echoed in every voice. Anna Ever, the administrator, tried to apply logic to the situation. Perhaps it was special treatment, she suggested from her bunk near the window. Perhaps they feed us well at first to make us compliant, and then the rations will decrease to normal prisoner levels. But even as she spoke, her voice carried doubt. The American soldiers had eaten the same food from the same kitchen, with the same casual abundance. This was not special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was simply how they ate. Erna, whose youth had not yet been completely hardened by cynicism, asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. What if everything we were told about America was a lie? The words hung in the darkness like an accusation. They had been taught that Americans were suffering under their war effort, that their economy was collapsing, that their people were starving, while their government poured resources into a foreign conflict that did not concern them. The thick potato soup and fresh bread suggested a very different reality, one in which American abundance was so great that even enemy prisoners could be fed generously without straining the system. Greta thought about the years of propaganda broadcasts she had heard, the newsreels showing American poverty and desperation, the speeches promising that Germany's enemies were on the verge of collapse. She had believed it all because believing had been easier than questioning, because doubt was dangerous in a society that punished dissent, because she had wanted to believe that her father's death and her brother's service in her own exhausting labor meant something. But now, lying in a clean American barracks with a full stomach for the first time in months, she could not ignore the evidence of her own experience. If they had lied about American abundance, what else had been a lie? Liesel spoke from across the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone older and more experienced than most of the others. I worked in hospitals during the retreat, she said quietly. I saw what we did to our own soldiers when we ran out of supplies. We left them behind. We abandoned the wounded because we could not feed them. She paused, and Greta heard her shift in her bunk. These Americans feed their prisoners better than we fed our own men. The observation settled over the room like a weight. It was one thing to acknowledge that American abundance exceeded their expectations. It was another thing entirely to confront the reality that their own government had chosen scarcity, had prioritized ideology over the basic care of its people and soldiers. The soup had been thick, yes, but its thickness revealed something much more disturbing than simple plenty. It revealed the vast gulf between what they had been told and what was actually true. And if that gulf existed regarding something as basic as food, how many other lies remained to be discovered? The morning brought work assignments and the beginning of a routine that would shape their days for months to come. Captain Hayes, through her translator, explained that the Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be given meaningful work and that the camp operated under strict adherence to international law. The women would be assigned tasks based on their skills and experience, and they would work alongside American personnel in various capacities. Greta found herself assigned to the camp's administrative office, her basic literacy in English having been noted during processing. The administrative office was a small building near the main gate, heated by a wood stove and filled with filing cabinets and typewriters. The work was familiar, organizing supply requisition forms and maintaining records tasks that required attention to detail, but not extensive language skills. Corporal Samuel Rosenberg supervised the office with a relaxed efficiency that would have been unthinkable in any German military setting Greta had experienced. He was 32 years old, a Jewish American from Brooklyn, whose family had fled Poland in 1938, barely escaping what would soon become a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. He had every reason to hate Germans, and Greta expected that hatred to manifest in deliberate cruelty, or at least cold indifference. Instead, he spoke slowly when addressing her, enunciating his words carefully so she could follow his meaning, and he showed her how to organize forms according to the camp's filing system with patient repetition. His patience surprised her. She had expected to be treated as a burden, as unwanted labor forced upon busy soldiers who had better things to do than train enemy prisoners. Instead, Rosenberg seemed genuinely interested in helping her understand her work, correcting her mistakes without criticism, and praising her progress when she mastered new tasks. During the mid-morning break, Rosenberg produced a thermos of coffee and 2 cups. He poured coffee for both of them without asking if she wanted any, then pushed a small tin across the desk toward her. Inside were cookies, homemade by his wife Rachel, he explained through gestures and simple English words. Greta stared at the cookies, those casual luxuries that represented yet another example of American abundance. In Germany, sugar had been rationed for years. Butter was precious save for essential uses rather than wasted on treats. The idea of baking cookies for mere pleasure seemed almost obscene. She took one cookie, biting into it carefully. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost too much after months of bland rations. Her taste buds, accustomed to deprivation, struggled to process the intensity of sugar and butter and vanilla. Rosenberg watched her reaction with amusement, then said something in English that included the word sweet, and a gesture that suggested he understood her shock. Then he did something that broke through Greta's carefully maintained emotional defenses. He pulled out a photograph from his wallet and showed it to her. His wife Rachel, round-faced and smiling, stood in a kitchen holding a mixing bowl. Two small children clung to her skirts, both grinning at the camera, with the unself-conscious joy of kids who knew they were loved. Greta looked at the photograph and felt something crack inside her chest. This enemy soldier was not a monster from propaganda films. He was a man who carried pictures of his family, who shared cookies baked by his wife, who spoke slowly so a German prisoner could understand him. She thought of her own family in Stuttgart, of her mother, who had once baked cookies before the war, made such luxuries impossible, of her younger brother Klaus, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and whose fate remained unknown. Rosenberg was not so different from Klaus. Both of them young men caught up in something larger than themselves, trying to maintain connection to home and family while the world burned around them. She managed to say thank you in English, the words awkward in her mouth but sincere. Rosenberg smiled and nodded, then went back to his paperwork as if sharing cookies with an enemy prisoner was the most natural thing in the world. Greta ate the cookie slowly, tasting not just the sweetness, but also the bitter realization that she had been fighting against people who were fundamentally human, who had families and kindnesses and ordinary lives. The propaganda had made it easier to be a soldier by making the enemy into something less than human, something that could be opposed without moral complexity. But thick soup and homemade cookies and family photographs were making that dehumanization impossible to maintain. Every act of casual kindness was an indictment of everything she had been taught. Every moment of ordinary humanity was evidence that the lies ran deeper than she had imagined. The second week brought a routine that began to feel almost normal, though Greta knew that normalcy itself was dangerous, a kind of forgetting that made captivity easier to bear, but harder to understand. Wake at 6 in the morning. Breakfast in the mess hall, always substantial, always more food than seemed reasonable for prisoners. Work assignments until noon. Lunch another generous meal. More work until 5. Dinner then evening hours in the barracks where the women gathered to talk in low voices about their pasts and their uncertain futures. But within that routine, Greta noticed something happening to the German women that none of them had anticipated. They were gaining weight, not dramatically, not obviously to anyone who saw them every day, but enough that uniforms that had hung loose now fit properly. Faces that had been gaunt were filling out. Energy that had been depleted was slowly returning. Bodies that had been running on fumes for months were remembering what it felt like to function normally. Liesel mentioned it during their evening gathering in the barracks, speaking with the clinical detachment of her medical training. "We were starving," she said simply. "Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly over years. We became so accustomed to hunger that we forgot what it felt like to have enough." The statement hung in the air, forcing each woman to confront a reality they had been avoiding. The German rations had been insufficient for so long that chronic malnutrition had become their normal state, the baseline against which they measured their bodies and their energy and their ability to function. Greta thought about the past 2 years in Stuttgart working 12-hour shifts in the factory. She remembered the constant fatigue, the way her hands had trembled during delicate work, the difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks. She had attributed it to stress, to the demands of wartime production, to worry about her brother at the front and her mother at home. Now she understood that much of it had been simple hunger. Her body had been slowly consuming itself, breaking down muscle and reserves to survive on inadequate rations, and she had been too indoctrinated to recognize it. Erna, who had been the thinnest among them, showed the most dramatic change. At 19, her body had still been trying to grow, even as it was starved of the nutrition needed for that growth. 2 weeks of American meals had brought color back to her cheeks and steadiness to her movements. She confessed one evening that she had stopped menstruating 8 months earlier, her body shutting down non-essential functions to survive. She had thought it was normal that war made such things happen to women, that it would return when the fighting stopped. Now with proper nutrition, she wondered if her body might remember how to function normally again. The realization of how hungry they had been created a strange new shame among the prisoners. They had been proud German women serving the Reich, believing they were making necessary sacrifices for victory. But their sacrifice had been built on a foundation of governmental neglect of leaders who had chosen to continue a war they could not win rather than adequately feed their people. Every thick soup, every piece of fresh bread, every meal that left them satisfied rather than still hungry served as evidence of how badly they had been failed by their own country. The Americans were not being exceptionally generous. They were simply feeding people properly, meeting basic standards of nutrition that any civilized society should provide. And that basic decency revealed the depths of German dysfunction. In the third week of November, Corporal Rosenberg began teaching Greta English through an unusual method that would transform more than just her language skills. He brought in his wife's recipe cards and used them as language lessons, each recipe becoming a vocabulary exercise, a grammar lesson, and a window into American domestic life that existed far from battlefields and prisoner camps. The first recipe was for apple pie. Rosenberg read it aloud slowly while Greta followed along on her own copies, sounding out unfamiliar words. Peel core slice, mix sugar and cinnamon, roll dough into crust. The instructions were simple, written for home cooks rather than professional bakers, but they contained depths of cultural information that Greta absorbed with a growing comprehension. Americans had enough sugar to bake pies for pleasure, not just for special occasions or celebrations, but as ordinary desserts that appeared on family tables whenever someone felt like making them. They had enough butter for pastry, enough to use generously, without worrying about exhausting limited supplies. They had enough apples to use 6 or 8 in a single dessert, treating fruit as abundant rather than precious. Each ingredient was an accusation against the propaganda she had believed, each measurement a piece of evidence that the American economy was not collapsing, but thriving. Rosenberg explained that his wife Rachel had learned these recipes from her own mother, who had learned them from hers, a chain of knowledge stretching back through generations of women who had brought their traditions from the old world and adapted them to the new. Food was how his family maintained connection to their heritage while building new lives in America. He spoke about Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered around a single table, about the importance of teaching children to cook traditional foods so they would remember where they came from, about how recipes carried memories and identity across time and distance. Greta listened and began to understand that American abundance was not just about having enough for survival. It was about having enough to share, enough to celebrate, enough to preserve cultural traditions through food. The thickness of the potato soup she had eaten on her first day represented more than adequate nutrition. It represented a society wealthy enough to feed even its enemies, generously confident enough in its resources to treat prisoners with dignity rather than deprivation. As her English improved through these culinary lessons, Greta found herself sharing German recipes in return. She taught Rosenberg about her mother's potato pancakes, crispy on the outside and tender inside, flavored with onions and served with applesauce. About Christmas stollen, the traditional bread heavy with dried fruits and dusted with powdered sugar. About the simple cabbage soups that had been staples of her childhood before the war turned even basic ingredients into luxuries. The act of translating recipes forced her to think carefully about vocabulary and grammar, to find English words for cooking techniques she had only known in German. But it also forced her to remember a Germany that had existed before the war, before the shortages, before the propaganda had poisoned everything. There had been a time when her mother's kitchen smelled of baking bread, when food was about family and tradition rather than mere survival. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, now to a different Greta who had lived in a different world. Other prisoners noticed the recipe exchanges and asked to join. Soon a small group gathered in the administrative office during breaks, sharing food memories and learning English through the universal language of cooking. Liesel contributed recipes from her medical training about nutrition and proper diet, explaining how certain combinations of foods provided complete proteins or how specific vitamins prevented specific deficiencies. Anna shared her grandmother's cake recipes from peacetime Vienna, elaborate confections that required ingredients no one had seen in years. Erna, whose family had been poor even before the war, learned about foods she had never tasted, but could now imagine through careful English descriptions. The recipe cards became a bridge between past and present, between German and American, between who they had been and who they might become. And with each recipe translated, each ingredient discussed, their English grew stronger and their connection to their former lives grew more complicated. December arrived with the first serious snow, transforming the camp into something almost peaceful. The war in Europe continued its grinding devastation, but within the compound's wire fences, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Captain Hayes announced that Christmas would be celebrated with a special meal, and she asked the German prisoners if they would like to contribute by preparing some traditional foods. The request caught the women off guard. They were prisoners being asked to participate in their captors' holiday celebration, to share their culture with people they were supposed to hate. The very idea seemed absurd, a violation of the clear boundaries that should exist between enemy and enemy. Yet Greta found herself volunteering along with Liesel and several others to help in the kitchen. The prospect of baking again, of creating something beautiful from basic ingredients, was too appealing to resist. The American cooks welcomed them with surprising enthusiasm, clearing workspace and listening intently as the German women explained traditional recipes through a combination of broken English hand gestures and Rosenberg's increasingly skilled translation. The camp's supply officer had somehow acquired ingredients that seemed impossible. Butter in quantities they had not seen in years. Sugar, real sugar, not the ersatz substitutes Germany had been using. Dried fruits that must have been hoarded from previous seasons. Spices that filled the kitchen with scents Greta had almost forgotten existed. When she asked where such luxuries came from during wartime, the supply sergeant shrugged and said simply that it was Christmas, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Americans celebrated abundance, treated generosity as a virtue rather than a weakness. They shared what they had because they had enough to share, and the sharing itself was part of the celebration. The preparation took 3 days of intensive work. The German women worked alongside American soldiers in the kitchen, their shared focus on food temporarily erasing the boundary between captor and captive. They made stolen the traditional German Christmas bread, heavy with fruits and nuts, kneading the rich dough until their arms ached. They prepared Lebkuchen, spice cookies that filled the kitchen with the scents of cinnamon and cloves and ginger. They created marzipan decorations, shaping the almond paste into delicate forms that seemed too beautiful to eat. And through it all, they taught the American cooks, shared techniques and stories, laughed at mistakes, and celebrated successes. An American private who had never baked anything more complicated than cornbread learned to shape stolen loaves. A German auxiliary who had been trained to operate radio equipment discovered she had a talent for decorative icing. The kitchen became a space outside normal categories, where former enemies worked together toward a common goal that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. But not everyone viewed this cooperation with approval. Sergeant Frank Coleman had arrived at Fort Devens in early December, transferred from a combat unit after what his file euphemistically called battle fatigue. He was 42 years old enough to have a son fighting age, and that son had been killed at the Battle of the Bulge on December 16th. The telegram had arrived on December 19th. Coleman reported for duty at Fort Devens on December 21st, his grief so fresh and raw that he could barely function through it. He saw the German women working in the kitchen, laughing as they shaped cookies, and something broke inside him. His son Robert had been 19 years old, just a year older than the youngest of these German prisoners. Robert had died in frozen Belgian mud while fighting the very army these women had served. And now they were here, safe and warm and well-fed, baking Christmas cookies, as if the war was some minor inconvenience rather than a catastrophe that had devoured his only child. Coleman confronted Captain Hayes in her office, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "My son died 6 weeks ago fighting these people. Now we are baking Christmas cookies with them." Captain Hayes looked up from her paperwork with an expression of genuine sympathy. "I am sorry for your loss, Sergeant. Truly, but these are auxiliary personnel, not combat soldiers. They operated radios and filed paperwork. They did not kill your son. They wore the uniform. They served the Reich. They are complicit in everything that regime did." Coleman's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You are being manipulated, Captain. These women are playing on your sympathies, pretending to be reformed, waiting for their chance to cause trouble." Hayes stood, her voice firm but not unkind. "I understand your grief, Sergeant Coleman, but my job is to run this facility according to regulations, and those regulations require humane treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Convention is not suspended because of personal feelings, mine or yours." Coleman left her office with his rage undiminished, but now it had focus and direction. He would prove that these German women were not the innocent victims Captain Hayes believed them to be. He would find evidence of their complicity in Nazi crimes, and he would ensure they faced justice rather than being coddled with American generosity. Christmas Eve dinner was unlike anything the prisoners had experienced during their captivity. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches and paper snowflakes created by American soldiers who seemed to approach the holiday with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere obligation. Long tables were set with actual tablecloths borrowed from local families who had donated them for the occasion. The American soldiers sat interspersed with German prisoners, no longer separated by nationality, but gathered as a community sharing a meal. The food arrived in waves of impossible abundance. Roasted turkey, a bird so large that Greta had trouble believing it came from a single animal. Ham glazed with brown sugar and studded with cloves, its surface caramelized to a deep amber. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter and cream so rich they seemed almost yellow. Vegetables that had been carefully preserved from autumn harvest, their colors bright against white serving dishes. Fresh bread, both American rolls and the German stolen the prisoners had helped prepare. And desserts. More desserts than seemed reasonable or necessary. Apple pies that used Rachel Rosenberg's recipe, their latticed crusts golden and perfect. German Lebkuchen arranged on platters with careful attention to presentation. Marzipan decorations that looked too delicate to eat, but tasted of almonds and sugar, and something that might have been memory. Captain Hayes stood to offer a brief speech before the meal began. She spoke about gratitude, about the privilege of having enough to share, about the hope that even in wartime, moments of peace and plenty could remind everyone of their common humanity. The translator struggled with some phrases, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Then she did something unexpected. She asked Greta to respond on behalf of the German prisoners to share their thoughts about this unusual Christmas celebration far from their homeland. Greta stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had not expected to speak publicly, had not prepared any words, and found herself facing a room full of people who waited with genuine interest for what she might say. She spoke in careful English, her accent thick but her grammar improving after weeks of practice with Rosenberg and the recipe cards. Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger as she found the words she needed. She began by thanking Captain Hayes and the American soldiers for their treatment of the prisoners for following the Geneva Convention, not just in letter but in spirit. But then she said something that surprised even herself. This meal makes us ashamed. Not ashamed of you, but ashamed of what we believed about you. The room went completely silent. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Greta felt her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she continued. We were told Americans were weak, that you were suffering, that you were our enemies who deserved destruction. But you feed us better than our own country fed us. You treat us with dignity we did not earn. You show us kindness we do not deserve. She paused, searching for the right words to express what she was feeling. We ate propaganda along with our thin soup in Germany. We swallowed lies because we were too hungry to question them. Now we sit at your table with more food than we have seen in years, and we must face the truth that everything we believed was false. Her voice cracked slightly. This abundance that you treat as normal shows us how badly we were deceived. When we return to Germany after the war, if we return, we will remember this Christmas. We will remember that American soldiers shared their abundance with prisoners who had been taught to hate them. We will remember that kindness is stronger than propaganda. She sat down abruptly, her brief eloquence exhausted, unsure if she had said too much or revealed too deeply the transformation happening inside her. Around her, she could see tears on the faces of other German women. Liesel was crying openly, not even trying to hide it. Erna stared at her plate as if the food had become accusatory. Anna's hands gripped her napkin with white-knuckled intensity. Captain Hayes' response was simple and direct. She raised her glass of cider and proposed a toast not to victory or defeat, but to the hope that wars would end and people could learn to see each other clearly without the distortions of hatred and propaganda. The toast was drunk by Americans and Germans alike, a small gesture of shared humanity in the middle of a conflict that still raged across two continents. Then they ate the abundance on the table, serving as both celebration and indictment, pleasure and guilt, intermingled in every bite. Sergeant Coleman watched from the back of the hall, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with a grief that had found no outlet except rage. He saw enemy women being rewarded with feasts, while his son lay in frozen ground. He saw Captain Hayes treating them like guests rather than prisoners. And he knew with absolute certainty that this was wrong, that justice demanded accountability, that kindness to enemies was a betrayal of everyone who had died fighting them. He would prove it. He would find evidence that these women were not innocent auxiliaries, but active participants in Nazi crimes. And then Captain Hayes would have to stop protecting them. The day after Christmas, Coleman began his investigation in earnest. He accessed the women's military records, captured documents that had been processed through Allied intelligence channels. He read through service histories, unit assignments, operational reports. Most of it was routine, the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that accumulates around any military organization. But then he found something that made him stop and read more carefully. Greta Hoffmann's signals unit had been assigned to coordinate communications for Wehrmacht operations in northern France during early 1944. The unit's responsibilities had included relaying messages between command posts, maintaining communication networks, and providing technical support for various military operations. Standard duties for a signals unit, nothing remarkable. But buried in the operational summaries, Coleman found references to specific missions that made his blood run cold. During March and April of 1944, Greta's unit had provided communication support for V-2 rocket operations targeting London and other British cities. The rockets launched from sites in occupied France had killed thousands of British civilians. The attacks had been deliberate, designed to terrorize the population rather than achieve any specific military objective. And Greta Hoffmann had been part of the communications network that made those attacks possible. Coleman brought his findings to Captain Hayes the next morning, laying the documents on her desk with barely controlled triumph. Hoffmann's unit helped coordinate V-2 attacks on London. Thousands of British civilians dead, and we are teaching her to bake apple pie. Captain Hayes read through the documents carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page. Finally, she looked up at Coleman. She was a communications operator, following orders. She did not launch the rockets. Following orders. Coleman's voice dripped with contempt. Where have I heard that excuse before? The Nazis at Nuremberg are using the same defense right now, and we are not accepting it from them. Why should we accept it from her? Hayes sat back in her chair, suddenly looking very tired. What do you want me to do? Sergeant, deny any asylum requests. Send them all back to Germany when the war ends. Do not let them escape justice by hiding in America. That is not my decision to make. That will be determined by the War Department based on individual assessments of each prisoner's role and culpability. Then make sure your assessment reflects the truth about what they did. Coleman pointed at the documents. This is not some innocent girl who got caught up in events beyond her control. This is someone who actively participated in attacks on civilians. That makes her a war criminal. After Coleman left, Captain Hayes sat alone in her office for a long time staring at the documents. She thought about Greta, who had worked so hard to learn English, who had shared her mother's recipes with such obvious nostalgia, who had spoken at Christmas with such genuine remorse. Was that all manipulation? Or could someone be complicit in terrible things without understanding what they were part of? The question had no easy answer. January 1945 brought letters from home delivered through Red Cross channels after months of processing and delay. The women gathered in the common area as their names were called, each one approaching to receive envelopes that might contain anything from joyful news to devastating loss. Most prepared themselves for the worst. Greta received a letter from a neighbor in Stuttgart, not from her mother. She opened it with trembling hands, already knowing that nothing good could come from a stranger writing instead of family. The neighbor wrote in careful script that Greta's mother had been killed in an air raid in October, 4 months earlier. The factory where Greta had worked was destroyed. The apartment building where she had grown up was now rubble. Her brother Klaus remained missing on the Eastern Front, no word received in over 8 months. The neighbor was sorry to be the bearer of such news, but thought Greta should know that she had no home to return to. Greta read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb information that rendered her entire previous existence into past tense. She was not just a prisoner of war anymore. She was a woman with no home, no family, no future except whatever she could build from nothing. The life she had known was gone as completely as if it had never existed. Similar news arrived for others. Liesel learned that her parents were living in the rubble of their bombed-out Hamburg home, surviving on charity and whatever could be scavenged. Anna discovered that her sister had been killed during the Soviet advance into eastern Germany. Erna's grandmother wrote that she was alone, too old to work, barely surviving on rations that were insufficient even by German standards. Each letter brought confirmation that Germany was not just defeated, but devastated that the country they remembered no longer existed except as ruins and desperate refugees. The thick American soup took on new meaning. It was not just better than German rations. It was sustenance in a world where the alternative might be nothing at all. That evening in the barracks, Anna Becker spoke words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. I cannot go back to Germany. There is nothing there. My sister is dead. My parents are missing. What am I returning to? Liesel nodded slowly. I could return to my parents in Hamburg and watch them starve. Or I could stay here and perhaps send them money to help them survive. Which choice honors them more, Erna? The youngest spoke with the bluntness of youth. I do not want to starve in rubble. I want to live. Is that wrong? The question hung in the air. Margaret Schmidt, 35 years old, and from Dresden, spoke with the authority of someone who had thought deeply about duty and loyalty. It is not wrong to want to live. But Germany needs us because it is broken. If everyone who survives chooses to abandon the homeland, who will rebuild? Greta found herself caught between two equally compelling truths. Margaret was right that Germany needed everyone who could help rebuild. But Greta also understood that returning to Germany meant returning to the lies, to the propaganda, to the system that had caused this catastrophe in the first place. Staying in America meant choosing truth over loyalty, future over past, hope over obligation. The debate continued late into the night with no resolution except a growing understanding that each woman would have to make her own choice based on her own circumstances and conscience. Corporal Rosenberg noticed Greta's withdrawn demeanor after she received her letter from Germany. Without asking intrusive questions or demanding explanations she was not ready to give, he modified her work assignments to include tasks that required more concentration and engagement with the present moment. He began teaching her more advanced English, moving beyond recipe cards to newspapers and official documents. One afternoon, he showed her a photograph from a New York newspaper, an image of concentration camp survivors being liberated by Allied forces. The people in the photograph looked like skeletons, dressed in striped rags, their eyes huge and sunken faces, their bodies so wasted that it seemed impossible they were still alive. The article described the systematic murder of millions, the industrial scale of the killing, the careful German efficiency applied to genocide. Rosenberg watched Greta's face as she looked at the photograph. This is what your government did. This is what the regime you served was built on. Greta felt physically sick. She ran to the latrine and vomited up her lunch, her body rejecting the knowledge along with the food. When she returned, pale and shaking, Rosenberg was still there. I did not know, she managed to say. I swear I did not know, I believe you. Rosenberg's voice was gentle. My family fled Poland before this started, but my cousin stayed behind. I will probably never know what happened to them, but I can guess. So I have every reason to hate you and everyone who wore that uniform. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I have worked with you for 2 months now. I have seen how you react when you learn the truth. You are not evil. You were ignorant. The question is what you do now that you know. Greta looked at him with tears streaming down her face. What can I do? I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back the dead. No, but you can choose who you become next. You can choose truth over lies even when truth is painful. You can choose to build something better rather than returning to what failed. That conversation stayed with Greta. Through the dark winter months, she began to understand that staying in America was not about escaping consequences or seeking comfort. It was about refusing to participate in a system built on lies, about choosing a future that acknowledged truth rather than a past that demanded willful blindness. February brought more evidence of Sergeant Coleman's investigation. He interviewed other prisoners, asking pointed questions about Greta's role in the signals unit, about what she knew and when she knew it. He requested additional documents from Allied intelligence, looking for any evidence that could prove active participation rather than mere compliance with orders. What he found was both damning and ambiguous. Yes, Greta's unit had supported V2 operations, but her role had been purely technical, relaying encrypted messages she could not read, maintaining equipment she did not understand the purpose of. She had been a small cog in a large machine, performing tasks that seemed routine at the time, but contributed to something monstrous. Coleman presented his findings to Captain Hayes again in March. The evidence proved she was complicit. Whether she understood what she was doing is irrelevant. The law does not accept ignorance as a defense. Hayes read through everything carefully. Then she made a decision that surprised Coleman. I will include all of this in my report to the War Department, but I will also include my assessment that Hoffman has demonstrated genuine remorse and significant personal transformation. The final decision about asylum will be made by people with more authority than either of us. That is not good enough. Coleman's voice rose. These women are war criminals. These women are human beings who made choices in impossible circumstances. Hayes met his eyes steadily. Your son's death was a tragedy, Sergeant Coleman, but punishing these women will not bring him back. It will only create more tragedy. Coleman left her office knowing he had lost this round but determined to continue fighting. Justice for his son demanded it. As winter turned toward spring, the women who wanted to stay began discussing their plans more openly. They knew that once the war in Europe officially ended, repatriation processes would begin quickly. If they wanted to request asylum, they would need to do so formally and be prepared to justify their choice. Greta Liesel, Anna Erna, and 5 others formed the core group. They met in the evenings to discuss what they would say, how they would explain their decision to stay with their former enemies, rather than return to their defeated homeland. The arguments they developed were both practical and philosophical. Practically, they had no homes to return to. Their families were dead or scattered. Their cities were rubble. Germany was occupied by foreign armies and would be for years to come. Returning meant choosing destitution and probable starvation over the possibility of building new lives. Philosophically, they had learned that Germany had lied to them about everything that mattered. The regime they had served had committed atrocities beyond imagination. The propaganda they had believed had been designed to make them complicit in crimes they would never have chosen if they had known the truth. Staying in America meant refusing to participate in that system, any longer choosing truth over national loyalty. But they also knew that Sergeant Coleman was building a case against them, that their request for asylum would be opposed by someone who had every reason to see them as enemies who deserved punishment rather than mercy. The question was whether Captain Hayes' support would be enough to overcome that opposition. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America and celebrations filling the streets of every town and city. In the prisoner camp at Fort Devens, the atmosphere was more complicated than simple joy or simple grief. For the American soldiers, it was a day of relief that the killing in Europe had finally stopped, though the war in the Pacific continued. For the German prisoners, it was a day of mourning, mixed with strange gratitude that the catastrophe their country had created was finally over. The war they had been part of was finished, and Germany had lost so completely that no propaganda could disguise the totality of the defeat. The Third Reich that some of them had believed in, however misguidedly, had collapsed into rubble and ash. The question now was what came next, not just for Germany, but for each of them individually. Captain Hayes called a general assembly of all prisoners to announce the beginning of repatriation procedures. She stood before them in the mess hall, her uniform pressed and proper, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that would determine the futures of the women in her charge. Transportation would be arranged within weeks, she explained. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. Her tone was formal, following the script she had been given by higher authorities, but it carried an undertone of something that sounded almost like regret. These women had been her responsibility for 6 months. She had watched them arrive as defeated enemies, hollow-eyed and starving, believing Americans were monsters who would torture them. She had watched them transform as they discovered that abundance and kindness could exist even between former enemies. She had seen genuine remorse develop as they learned the truth about what their government had done. And now she was supposed to send them back to the ruins of the country that had lied to them. But before she could finish explaining the repatriation procedures, Greta stood up. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, could hear it rushing in her ears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Captain Hayes, may I speak for some of us? Permission was granted with a nod. Hayes looked curious and somewhat concerned about what might come next. Greta took a deep breath and looked around at the other prisoners, making eye contact with Liesel and Erna and several others who had participated in the late-night discussions about their futures. Then she said words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Some of us wish to request permission to remain in America rather than return to Germany. The statement created immediate confusion among the American personnel. Several guards exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. The translator seemed uncertain whether he had understood properly. Captain Hayes' expression showed complete surprise, though Greta could not tell if it was pleasant or unpleasant surprise. Greta continued before anyone could interrupt. We understand this is unusual. We know we are prisoners of war and that the Geneva Convention provides for our repatriation. But we ask you to consider our circumstances before making final decisions. 9 women stood slowly joining Greta in her unprecedented request. Liesel, whose medical skills had made her valuable to the camp's operations. Erna, who had found unexpected talent in mechanical repairs. Anna, who had discovered that administration skills translated across languages and cultures. 6 others, whose names and skills had become familiar to the American personnel over months of daily interaction. They stood together, their faces showing fear and hope in equal measure, their former enemies for the extraordinary privilege of not returning to freedom in their own country. The reaction in the room was stunned silence. Captain Hayes looked at her superior officers who had attended the assembly for the formal repatriation announcement. The German prisoners who had not stood watched with expressions ranging from shock to understanding to outright disapproval. This was a moment that had no precedent, no protocol, no clear answer. Before Captain Hayes could respond, Sergeant Coleman stood from his position at the back of the room. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Captain, this is precisely the manipulation I warned you about. These women served the Reich. Some of them coordinated attacks on civilians. Now they want to escape justice by staying here, unacceptable. Hayes turned to face him, her expression carefully controlled. They are requesting asylum, Sergeant, which is their right under international law to petition for. They are requesting to avoid consequences. Coleman's voice shook with barely contained rage. My son died fighting the country they served. They do not get to find sanctuary on American soil while he lies in Belgian ground. Greta spoke again, her English clear, despite the trembling in her voice. Sergeant Coleman, I am sorry for your loss, truly, but I did not kill your son. I did not start this war. I was a factory worker who believed lies and joined the Auxiliary Corps thinking I was defending my home. I was wrong, Germany was wrong, and I cannot return to a country built on those lies. Coleman's face flushed red. Convenient realization now that you have lost. Captain Hayes raised her hand for silence. Enough, this decision is above my authority. I will forward the request to the War Department. They will decide based on individual assessments and circumstances. But these women have the right to make the request. She looked at Greta and the others who were standing. You will need to submit formal written applications explaining your reasons for requesting asylum. You will need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for you and provide initial support. And you should understand that approval is not guaranteed. The War Department will consider many factors, including Sergeant Coleman's concerns about wartime activities. Coleman stormed out of the mess hall, his fury radiating from every rigid line of his body. The women who had stood slowly sat back down, suddenly aware of how much they had just risked by making their request public. That evening, Margaret Schmidt confronted Greta in the barracks. She was one of the 14 women who had chosen to return to Germany, and her voice carried both anger and something that might have been hurt. You are choosing comfort over duty. You are choosing thick soup over loyalty to your homeland. Greta met her eyes steadily. I am choosing truth over lies. I am choosing a future over a past that never existed. Germany sent us to fight for something that was built on propaganda and cruelty. I will not return to serve a country that fed me lies while my enemies fed me honestly. The exchange created a tension that would never fully resolve between the women who were leaving and those who hoped to stay. Both groups understood that each choice required courage, that neither decision was simple or easy. Those who stayed would have to build entirely new lives in a foreign country as former enemies. Those who returned would have to rebuild their lives in the ruins of a defeated nation. Both futures were uncertain and frightening in different ways. The process of transitioning from prisoners of war to potential immigrants proved complex and bureaucratically challenging. The 9 women who had requested asylum needed sponsors, American citizens or organizations willing to vouch for them and provide initial support as they attempted to build new lives. Captain Hayes worked with local church groups and community organizations to identify potential sponsors, But she also made it clear that sponsorship required more than just paperwork. It required Americans willing to embrace former enemies as neighbors and colleagues. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, immediately offered to sponsor Greta. Patricia Henderson was a school teacher in her 50s who had been impressed by Greta's intelligence and her rapid mastery of English through the recipe card lessons with Rosenberg. More importantly, she had been moved by Greta's genuine remorse about the revelations regarding the Nazi regime's actions. "You are not responsible for things you never knew about," Mrs. Henderson told her during one of their conversations. "The question is what you do with the knowledge you have now. And I believe you are choosing to do the right thing, Doctor." Robert Hayes, the camp's medical officer, arranged for Liesel to continue her nursing training at Worcester General Hospital. Her careful attention to detail and natural empathy had impressed him during months of working together in the medical facility. "She has a gift for healing," he told Captain Hayes. "It would be a waste to send her back to starve in rubble when she could be saving lives here." Erna found sponsorship through an unexpected source. Thomas Wright was a local mechanic who had heard about the young German woman who had discovered an unusual talent for repairing complicated machinery. His own sons had been killed in the Pacific Theater, and his wife had initially been hostile to the idea of helping a former enemy. But when Wright met Erna and saw her work on a broken generator, bringing it back to life with patient attention and intuitive understanding, he recognized genuine skill that transcended nationality. "She reminds me of my boys," he told his wife, "always taking things apart to see how they worked. Maybe helping her is a way of honoring them." The other women who had requested asylum found similar paths forward. Each one was creating a foothold in American society, building possibilities from the foundation of skills they had developed during their captivity. And each sponsorship represented an American family or organization willing to look past wartime propaganda and recognize the humanity in former enemies. But Sergeant Coleman continued his counter-campaign. He wrote directly to the War Department detailing his findings about Greta's unit and their involvement in V-2 rocket operations. He argued that allowing these women to remain in America would be a betrayal of everyone who had died fighting Germany. He created local pressure by speaking to American Legion chapters and Gold Star families, some of whom supported his position, while others argued that the war was over and it was time for mercy. The division extended into the Fort Devens community itself. Some Americans believed the women deserved a second chance, that they had been genuinely reformed by their experience. Others believed that service to the Nazi regime, regardless of circumstances, should disqualify them from finding sanctuary in America. Greta watched from inside the camp as Americans debated her fate in newspaper editorials and town hall meetings. Then Corporal Rosenberg did something that shifted the conversation. He gave a statement to the local newspaper about the controversial asylum requests. As a Jewish American whose family had fled Nazi persecution, his voice carried particular weight. "My family has every reason to hate these women," he told the reporter. "My cousins died in camps we are only now discovering the full horror of. But I have worked with Greta Hoffman for 7 months. She was ignorant, not evil. When I told her about the camps, about what was being done to my people, she was physically sick." Real tears, real remorse. We can choose vengeance or we can choose transformation. I choose transformation. His testimony, published in the Worcester Telegram, shifted public opinion significantly. It was one thing for Captain Hayes to advocate for the prisoners. It was another thing entirely for a Jewish American who had lost family to the Holocaust to argue for mercy toward Germans. Coleman remained unmoved, but he found his support eroding. Even some Gold Star mothers who had initially sided with him began to question whether punishment of these particular women would honor their sons' sacrifices or simply perpetuate the cycle of hatred that had caused the war in the first place. In late May, the War Department's decision arrived. Captain Hayes read it first, then called Greta to her office to deliver the news. The decision was complex, reflecting the difficulty of the questions involved. Those wishing immediate repatriation to Germany would be accommodated. Transportation was being arranged for early June. Those requesting asylum had been approved on a provisional basis, subject to multiple conditions. They would need to maintain their sponsorships. They would need to report monthly to immigration officials. They would be subject to ongoing review. And while no formal war crimes charges were being filed against auxiliary personnel, their wartime activities would remain part of their permanent records. "It is not a full pardon," Hayes explained. It is a chance. What you do with that chance will determine whether it becomes permanent residency or eventual deportation. Greta felt tears streaming down her face. It was more than she had dared to hope for this opportunity to build a new life, even if it came with conditions and uncertainty. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you for supporting us. Hayes smiled slightly, thanked the War Department, and thanked Corporal Rosenberg. His testimony was probably the deciding factor. When a Jewish American argues for mercy toward Germans, people listen. After Greta left, Coleman appeared in Hayes's office. He had heard about the decision and wanted to register his formal objection. You are making a mistake. These women are enemies. They were enemies, Sergeant Ed. Now they are survivors trying to build better lives. Hayes's voice was gentle but firm. I am sorry about Robert. Truly. But punishing these women will not bring him back. It is not about punishment. It is about justice. Sometimes mercy is justice. Sometimes giving people the chance to become better than they were is the highest form of justice we can offer. Coleman walked away without responding, but something in his rigid posture had softened slightly. He was not reconciled, not yet, but perhaps he was beginning to understand that his son's death did not have to be honored through vengeance. The final repatriation day arrived in late June 1945. The women who had chosen to return to Germany gathered their few possessions and prepared for the journey back to an uncertain future. The atmosphere was heavy with complicated emotions. Those leaving carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented, one that contradicted everything they had been taught before their capture. The farewell gathering in the mess hall was unlike any military proceeding that Captain Hayes had ever conducted. American soldiers who had guarded these women, worked alongside them, and gradually befriended them, now stood with obvious emotion as they said goodbye. Rosenberg had tears in his eyes as he hugged those who were leaving and wished them success in their uncertain futures. Dr. Hayes shook hands formally with the women he had treated, his voice rough when he told them he hoped they would find healing in their homeland. Even the camp commander, who had maintained professional distance throughout the prisoners' time at Fort Devens, spoke with genuine warmth about their transformation and his hope that they would help build a better Germany from the ruins of the old. The women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles that would take them to Boston and then to ships bound for Europe. It was a strange reversal of their arrival months earlier. Then they had all been prisoners facing an uncertain future in enemy captivity. Now some were returning to freedom in their homeland, while others were choosing to remain with their former captors. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but these were journeys chosen rather than simply endured. Margaret Schmidt, who had argued so passionately for returning to Germany, embraced Greta before boarding the truck. I hope you find what you are looking for in America, she said quietly. I hope it is worth what you are giving up. Greta held her friend tightly. I hope you find that Germany can become what we both wish it had been. They released each other, both crying, and Margaret climbed into the truck. As the vehicles disappeared down the road, Greta felt a profound sense of loss mixed with equally profound relief. She was losing connection to everyone who shared her language and culture and history. But she was gaining the freedom to define herself without the weight of that history crushing her. After the transport vehicles disappeared, the 9 women who remained faced a new reality. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were displaced persons in the process of becoming immigrants, a status that carried both opportunity and vulnerability. The camp would continue operating for several more weeks while final paperwork was processed, but their relationship to it had fundamentally changed. They were no longer confined by wire fences and guard towers. They were guests waiting for permission to begin their new lives. Greta spent her final days at Fort Devens, helping Rosenberg train her replacement in the administrative office. She found herself feeling nostalgic for the small building where she had learned English through recipe cards and discovered that enemies could become friends through patient teaching and shared cookies. This place had been her prison, but it had also been the location of her transformation from a woman who believed propaganda to someone who questioned everything and chose her own path forward based on evidence rather than ideology. On her last evening before moving to the Henderson home, Greta walked through the now quiet camp, remembering the woman she had been when she arrived. That Greta had been defeated, hungry, and certain that Americans would treat her with the cruelty she had been promised. This Greta was well-fed, hopeful, and certain of nothing except that kindness and abundance could change everything. She thought about that first bowl of thick potato soup, about how its richness had begun to crack the foundation of lies she had built her life upon. Food had been the weapon that defeated her more completely than any battle could have. And in her defeat, she had discovered something worth building a new life around. Truth tasted better than propaganda, even when truth was difficult to swallow. Before she left, Sergeant Coleman approached her. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the Christmas when she had given her speech. His face still carried grief, would probably always carry it, but the rage had dimmed to something more manageable. "I still think you should be going back to Germany," he said without preamble. "I still think serving the Reich makes you complicit in what it did." Greta nodded. "You are right, I am complicit. I relayed messages that helped coordinate attacks on civilians. I did not know what those messages meant, but my ignorance does not erase the consequences." Coleman seemed surprised by her direct acknowledgement. "Then why should you get to stay? Because I cannot change what I did, but I can choose what I do next. Because returning to Germany means participating in a system that has not admitted its lies, while staying here means building something honest from the ruins of dishonesty. Because your son died fighting against lies, and the best way I can honor that is by refusing to live in them anymore." Coleman was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that cost him visible effort. "My wife thinks I should forgive you. She says Robert would not want me to spend the rest of my life hating." Greta met his eyes. "I do not need your forgiveness, Sergeant Coleman. I need to earn the right to live here through how I live my life. But if forgiveness is something you can give, I will accept it as a gift I do not deserve." He nodded slowly and walked away. It was not reconciliation, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement that both of them were trying to find their way through impossible grief towards something that might eventually resemble peace. 20 years passed with the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments that build a life. Greta Hoffman became Greta Henderson after marrying Robert Henderson, Patricia's nephew, a school teacher who had returned from the Pacific Theater with his own complicated feelings about enemies and forgiveness. They built a home in Worcester, raised 3 children who spoke English without accents but learned German from their mother's bedtime stories. Greta worked as a translator for the State Department, helping process the thousands of displaced persons who continued arriving from war-torn Europe long after the fighting stopped. Her experience as someone who had been stateless gave her particular insight into the needs of refugees who had nowhere to return to. She helped hundreds of people navigate the complicated bureaucracy of immigration, always remembering how Captain Hayes and Rosenberg and the Hendersons had helped her navigate those same systems. Liesl never married, dedicating her life instead to nursing. She became head nurse at Worcester General Hospital and was known for her particular compassion toward patients who had experienced trauma and displacement. She often said that her experience as a prisoner had taught her that healing required more than medical skill. It required recognizing the humanity in every person, regardless of their past or their circumstances. Erna married Thomas Wright 2 years after the war ended, their union raising eyebrows in the community, but creating a bond based on shared love of machinery and quiet understanding of loss. Erna eventually opened her own repair shop, becoming one of the few female mechanics in Massachusetts and earning respect through skill rather than sympathy. The 9 women who had stayed maintained close contact with each other over the years, gathering monthly for dinners where they spoke German and remembered the strange journey that had brought them to America. These gatherings always featured food, often the same thick potato soup that had first shocked them into recognizing American abundance. But now they made it themselves, teaching their children and grandchildren the recipe while telling stories about what that soup had meant when they first tasted it as hungry prisoners. They also maintained correspondence with the women who had returned to Germany, creating a network of letters that spanned the Atlantic. Those who had gone back wrote about the challenges of rebuilding their lives in devastated cities, but also about how their experience in America had given them hope and different perspectives. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. In 1965, Greta received an invitation that would bring her story full circle. The United Nations was hosting a conference on reconciliation and post-war recovery, and they had requested her participation as someone who embodied the possibility of transformation between former enemies. She was asked to speak about her experience, to share how a bowl of soup and consistent kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Standing before that international audience, she would finally articulate what she had been unable to express in her limited English 20 years earlier. The United Nations conference room in New York was filled with diplomats, scholars, and survivors from conflicts around the world. Greta stood at the podium with the same small leather diary she had carried since her days as a young Auxiliary Corps member in Germany. Her three children sat in the audience, American-born, but connected to a history they knew only through their mother's carefully chosen stories. Robert sat beside them, his hand resting on their eldest daughter's shoulder, proud of the woman his wife had become. Greta began by describing that November day in 1944, when she had arrived at Fort Devens expecting cruelty and finding instead a thick potato soup that challenged everything she believed. She spoke about how abundance, when offered without cruelty or condescension, could be more powerful than any weapon in breaking down the walls of hatred built by propaganda. The Americans did not defeat us with their military might alone, she told the assembly. They defeated us with their consistent demonstration that everything we had been told about them was a lie. She explained how food had become the language of transformation in that small camp. Every meal that left them satisfied rather than hungry was evidence that their own government had failed them more completely than their enemies ever could. Every shared recipe, every cooking lesson, every moment of casual abundance demonstrated that Americans were not the monsters of propaganda, but ordinary people who happened to have enough and were willing to share it. That generosity, she said, was what had made 9 women choose to stay with their captors rather than return to freedom in their homeland. But Greta also spoke about the complicated nature of that choice, the guilt that came with abundance, the shame of recognizing how completely they had been deceived. We did not choose America because it was easy, she explained. We chose it because we had learned that truth, however painful, was better than comforting lies. We chose it because we discovered that home is not just where you come from, but where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. She held up her diary, the same one she had clutched on that first day of captivity. In this diary, I wrote questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become? America gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given. That freedom, more than the thick soup or the fresh bread or the coffee, was what made me want to stay. Greta concluded by addressing the core purpose of the conference. If we want reconciliation after conflict, we must be willing to see our former enemies clearly without the distortions of wartime propaganda. We must be willing to offer not just justice, but also mercy. We must remember that abundance shared with former enemies is not weakness, but the strongest possible foundation for lasting peace. The story of 9 German women who begged to stay with their American captors reminds us that transformation is possible when societies choose generosity over vengeance, truth over propaganda, and hope over hatred. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Greta was not looking at the applauding delegates. She was looking at the back corner of the room where Frank Coleman sat, now 63 years old and long retired from military service. He had not reconciled easily with what had happened at Fort Devens. It had taken him years to accept that mercy toward his son's enemies might honor Robert's sacrifice more than vengeance would. But he had come to this speech, and when the applause began, he stood slowly, reluctantly, but he stood. After the speech during the reception, Coleman approached Greta. They had not seen each other in nearly 20 years. "Your son would be proud of you," he said quietly. The words seemed to cost him effort, but he said them anyway. Greta felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you for coming, Sergeant Coleman. It means more than you know." He nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "My wife was right all those years ago. Robert would not have wanted me to spend my life hating. I am glad you stayed. I am glad you proved me wrong." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the crowd of delegates and diplomats. But Greta stood there for a long moment, feeling something settle into place that had been unresolved for 2 decades. Later that evening, back at her hotel, Greta sat with her children and her husband and told them the whole story, the parts she had never shared before. She told them about Sergeant Coleman's son dying in Belgium just weeks before she arrived at Fort Devens, about Coleman's investigation and his determination to send them back to Germany, about Captain Hayes standing up to him, about Rosenberg's testimony, despite having every reason to hate Germans, And she told them about the thick potato soup that had started it all, how something as simple as adequate food had revealed the lies she had built her life upon. Her youngest daughter, 15 years old and idealistic, asked the question that mattered most. "Mom, do you ever regret not going back to Germany?" Greta considered the question carefully, wanting to give an answer that honored both the life she had chosen and the life she had left behind. "Germany was where I was born, but America is where I learned to choose truth over lies. That choice made me free in a way I never was in my homeland. So no, sweetheart, I do not regret it." The next morning before leaving New York, Greta visited a small deli in Brooklyn that Rosenberg had told her about decades earlier. It was run by a cousin of his, a survivor of the camps, who had rebuilt his life in America. She ordered potato soup, wanting to see if it would taste the same as memory. It was thick and rich and well-seasoned, and it tasted like possibility, like the future she had chosen, like truth. She thought about all the women whose lives had been changed by that first meal at Fort Devens, the 9 who stayed and built new lives, the 14 who returned and rebuilt Germany from its ruins, the American soldiers who had chosen mercy over vengeance, the families who had sponsored former enemies, the whole complicated network of people who had chosen transformation over hatred. And she thought about a simple truth she had learned in that Massachusetts prisoner camp 21 years earlier. Food shared with enemies becomes a bridge. Abundance offered without cruelty becomes a weapon against lies. And kindness, consistent and genuine, is more powerful than any propaganda. The story of those 23 German women and the Americans who fed them was not just about one camp and one war. It was about the choice every person and every society faces when conflict ends. The choice between vengeance and mercy, between hatred and hope, between the comfort of lies and the difficulty of truth. Greta Hoffman Henderson had chosen truth. And in that choice, she had discovered that the most profound freedom was not freedom from captivity, but freedom to become someone new, someone better, someone who refused to let the lies of the past define the possibilities of the future. She finished her soup and left the deli, stepping out into the bright New York morning. Somewhere in Germany, Margaret Schmidt was probably having her own lunch, building her own life in the country they had both served and both lost. Both of them had made the choices they needed to make. Both of them had found their own ways forward through the ruins. And somewhere in heaven, if such a place existed, perhaps Greta's mother and Frank Coleman's son were sharing a meal together, no longer divided by the propaganda that had sent them to war, finally able to see each other clearly as the humans they had always been. The thick soup had taught Greta that simple truth, that beneath all the uniforms and flags and slogans, beneath all the lies and hatred and fear, there were just people trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to build something worth leaving behind. She had built her life on that truth. And 21 years later, standing in Brooklyn with the taste of potato soup still on her tongue, she knew she had made the right choice. Truth had tasted better than propaganda. It always would.